I remember the summer of 1066 as one of restless whispers, of uneasy prayers, and of a kingdom that seemed to stand on the edge of a blade. England had buried King Edward the Confessor, a pious man who left no son to inherit his throne. Instead, he left us uncertainty, and uncertainty in our age was blood's most certain herald. When Harold Godwinson, our Earl and rightful protector, seized the crown, I swore my loyalty to him without hesitation. He was a man of iron, forged in battle, and he had defended these lands long before any crown weighed upon his brow. Yet as much as I admired him, I knew England's throne was a seat of shadows. There were men across the seas who believed it theirs by right, men who whispered of conquest and vengeance. It was not long before the first of those shadows took form. Word reached us that Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, the last great Viking thunderer, was sailing for our shores. They said he came not alone, but with a great fleet of 300 ships, and worse still, with our own countrymen by his side. Tostig Godwinson, Harold's brother, once Earl of Northumbria, who had betrayed us all. The news struck harder than steel. Tostig, of Harold's own blood, stood with the Northmen. He knew our weaknesses, our strongholds, our people. Betrayal such as this stank fouler than rot. We had faced Norsemen before, yes, but never with the hand of an English traitor guiding them. I still remember the fear that rippled through the villages. Mothers clutching their children at the sight of sails on the horizon, fathers sharpening rusted spears, though they knew such steel would shatter against a Viking axe. The monks prayed longer hours, their chants quivering through cloisters, as though they might bind heaven to shield our shores. But fear walked faster than prayer. When Harold called his levies, I marched with them. I was no stranger to battle, though I was no noble lord. I was a knight of modest standing, my armour patched in places, my sword not as fine as those carried by the kings of Skarls. Yet I carried something sharper than steel, the weight of loyalty. I would not see England burned, not by Norse raiders, not by traitors who turned against their own. Our king knew we had no time to waste. Hardrada had already stormed the north, joined by Tostig, and they had crushed the men of Northumbria at Fulford. Blood darkened that soil, and York was theirs for the taking. If they secured the north, they would march south with fire and pillage, and England's heart would fall with it. So Harold did what no other would dare. He marched us north in a thunder of feet and sweat, 200 miles in less than a fortnight, through roads of mud, over rivers swollen with autumn rains, and fields where the harvest rotted beneath our boots. Men bled from their feet, their armour chafed skin raw, yet no one dared falter. Betrayal had lit a fire in us hotter than hunger. We would reach the Vikings, or England itself would perish. By night, as we camped under dripping skies, I lay awake thinking of Tostig. I'd seen him once before, years earlier, when he still held his earldom. Proud, sharp-tongued, a man who carried himself as though he were carved from iron, yet he had always been restless, jealous of his brother Harold, forever nursing slights both real and imagined. That such a man would now ride with Norse raiders did not surprise me, but it cut deep all the same. Brother against brother, English against English. No prayer could cleanse such treachery. When dawn came on the day we reached Stamford Bridge, the mist clung thick to the fields, curling over the river Derwent like ghostly fingers. We heard them before we saw them, the sound of laughter, of men drunk on their victory at Fulford, drunk on the belief that no English force would reach them so swiftly. The Vikings thought Harold still far to the south, unready, unprepared. They had left their armour behind, basking in the late summer sun, and some had even scattered to gather plunder. We looked upon them from the ridge, our breath heavy, our limbs weary from the march, but our spirits burning like forged fire. Harold stood tall before us, his sword raised, his voice carrying across the lines. Today we take back England. Today we answer betrayal with steel. The cheer that erupted shook the very earth. I tightened my grip on my sword and prayed silently, not for mercy, nor for life, but for strength. Betrayal had brought the Vikings to our soil, but vengeance would send them back to their graves. The horn sounded. We marched toward the bridge. I'd faced many enemies in my years of service, yet none unsettled me like the thought of meeting Tostig Godwinson across the field. An Englishman, born of the same blood as our king, now sworn to the side of our foes. His betrayal cut deeper than any Viking axe could. We whispered his name in campfires as though it were a curse. Tostig, who once ruled Northumbria, who sat in English halls and feasted at English tables, now rode with Norse raiders who burned those very lands. It was not just a rebellion of ambition. It was treachery against kin, against hearth and home. Men spat when they spoke his name. Some cursed him openly, calling him the snake of the Godwinson brood. Others, quieter, said betrayal was worse than invasion, for it made every bond suspect. If a brother could turn against his king, what of neighbours, allies, even friends? I wrestled with it myself. I had seen Harold and Tostig together once, years earlier, before ambition soured their bond. There had been laughter then, the kind of laughter only brothers share, born of rivalry and trust. To think of that laughter now turned my stomach to stone. We marched still, step after step through the endless miles of mud and bloodied boots. I could feel the weight of betrayal pressing into our very march, as if each mile we crossed was not only against the Vikings, but against one of our own. The men did not say it aloud, but each of us carried the fire of revenge, not only for Fulford's dead, not only for the towns pillaged, but for the wound carved by Tostig's hand. When we finally neared York, the stories grew darker. Villagers who had fled from Fulford spoke of how Tostig himself had led the charge against his countrymen. They said he mocked the English, his Viking allies split men open, that his laughter carried over the clash of shields. I did not know if the stories were true, but they stoked the rage in every soldier's chest until it boiled hotter than the forge. Yet Harold, our king, bore it differently. He did not curse Tostig's name, as the rest of us did. When we halted near Stamford Bridge to gather strength, I watched him alone by the river, his face heavy with thought. He was no stranger to betrayal. He had wrestled power from the Norman-backed claims of William. He had fought to steady England's throne. But this was a wound deeper still. Blood had turned against blood. The night before the battle, Harold called us close. His words I will never forget. Tomorrow we face not only Hardrada and his Northmen, but my brother. Remember this, he is not my kin any longer. He chose his bed among our enemies, and there he shall lie. Let no man think of him as English. He is a traitor, and a traitor's fate awaits him. There was silence after those words, silence heavy with sorrow and rage alike. It was one thing to march against Norse raiders, but another to raise sword against the flesh of your own land. And yet, betrayal demanded no mercy. As dawn approached, I tightened the straps of my armor and thought of my own family. If I fell that day, I wanted my last thought to be of loyalty, not of despair. For what is a knight, if not the opposite of a traitor? We live and die by our oath. And mine was to Harold, to England, and to the men who marched beside me through hell's miles of mud. When the horns finally sounded, and we advanced toward Stamford Bridge, the mist lifted to reveal the Vikings spread in careless ease, drinking, laughing, sharpening blades that were meant for us. And among them, I thought I saw him, Tostig, clad in the garb of his new masters, standing tall with his betrayer's pride. The rage in my chest burned hot, but even hotter was the resolve. Betrayal would end here, at the edge of this river, beneath the weight of English steel. And I swore to myself that if fate placed me within reach of Tostig, I would not hesitate. Blood had no claim when betrayal poisoned it. The horns of war tore the mist apart. What moments earlier had been the laughter of Vikings sprawled across the meadow turned into startled cries as our ranks surged forward like a storm breaking upon the shore. I had seen battles before, but never one like this. The Vikings had not expected us. Many of them had left their armor aboard their ships, their shields stacked carelessly in piles. The sun gleamed off bare shoulders and half-donned mail shirts. They had come to Stamford Bridge not for war, but for triumph, thinking England had already bent its knee. But England had marched, and England had come for vengeance. We charged down the slope with a roar that rattled the very sky. Our shields locked. Our spears bristled like a forest of iron. My breath thundered in my helm. Sweat slicked my palms. Yet rage steadied my hand. Ahead, I saw the Vikings scramble into formation, shouting in their harsh tongue, dragging axes and swords from the grass. The crash, when it came, was like thunder splitting the world. Our shield walls smashed into theirs, wood splintering, metal shrieking as blades found flesh. The first man I struck was barely armoured, and my sword cut deep into his shoulder, spilling his blood into the mud. The second came at me with a spear, his eyes wild, but I caught it on my shield and drove my blade up beneath his ribs. Everywhere around me was chaos. The Vikings fought with a savage fury, their axes hacking down, splitting shields, cleaving limbs. But we had the advantage, discipline, armour, and the element of surprise. And for every Viking who fell, I remembered Fulford. For every corpse at my feet, I remembered Tostig's betrayal. The meadow turned into a slaughter. I saw Hardrada himself at one point, towering above his men, a giant of a man in mail, swinging a great two-handed axe with the strength of Thor himself. Each strike sent men sprawling, shields shattered, bones crushed. His voice roared across the battlefield, rallying his warriors even as our swords cut them down. And near him, I thought I saw Tostig, pale-haired, grim-eyed, standing amidst his foreign allies, as if he had never been English at all. My stomach turned with both rage and sorrow. It was one thing to slay Northmen. It was another to see one of our own leading them. The battle raged on, and I felt time blur, minutes or hours, I could not tell. My arms burned from the weight of my shield, my sword nicked and notched from endless strikes. Men screamed, horses shrieked, steel sang its merciless song. Blood spattered my visor, clogging my vision, but still I pressed on, for the fire in my chest could not be quenched. And yet, despite our surprise, the Vikings did not yield. They fought like beasts cornered, their shield wall reforming again and again, axes biting into our line. They were giants, hardened by years of raiding, and each one seemed to take 3 Englishmen to bring down. It was then the tide of the battle shifted, not because of numbers, but because of one man. One Viking warrior, broad as an ox and wild as a storm, planted himself at the narrow wooden bridge that crossed the river. Alone, he held the span, cutting down every Englishman who dared step forward. His axe swung like death's own scythe, splitting helmets, shearing spears, driving men into the water below. We tried again and again, sending knights 2 at a time, then 3, but each one fell. The bridge became slick with blood, littered with bodies, and still he stood, roaring defiance at the entire English host. For a moment, I felt awe. This was no mere man. This was a wall of flesh and fury, holding back a kingdom, but all could not win wars. And as I stood there, chest heaving, I realized what must be done. The order was given. One of our men slipped beneath the bridge, crawling along the riverbank with a spear. I watched as he plunged it upward, piercing the Viking giant from below. The warrior roared one final time, his axe clattering into the river, and his great body fell with a crash. The bridge was ours, and with it, so too would be victory. I will never forget the sight of that lone warrior who stood at the wooden span of Stamford Bridge. His axe glinted like a shard of lightning, his stance wide and immovable, and his roar carried above the chaos of battle like the voice of some pagan god. He was not clad in shining mail, armoured like a knight. His body was half-bared, muscles corded like ship ropes, veins bulging with fury. Around his feet already lay the broken forms of the first men who had dared to charge him, their blood turning the plank slick. Yet he did not falter. With every swing, another Englishman fell. With every strike, he seemed less a man and more a beast of legend. We hurled ourselves at him again and again, each time with more desperation. Two men side by side tried to push him back, their shields raised high. But with one great sweep of his axe, he split one man's helm, as though it were brittle clay, and the other tumbled screaming into the river below. Arrows flew at him, but the gods seemed to shield his flesh, for he dodged or deflected them with movements too fast for such a giant. The air grew thick with the smell of blood and sweat. My sword arm ached from the endless fighting, yet I stood frozen, watching as this single Northman held back the might of England. Men muttered prayers, some even cursed in awe, as if we faced not flesh but fate itself. I thought of the sagas the Norse told, their boasts of heroes who could fight 100 men, who could stand at the gates of Valhalla unbroken. And I realized, in that moment, we were staring at one of those sagas made flesh. He fought not only with strength, but with the desperation of a doomed army. Behind him, the Vikings shouted encouragement, their morale clinging to his defiance. If he held the bridge, they might yet rally. If he fell, their dream would crumble. Harold himself rode forward, his face grim beneath his helm. He shouted commands, sending our bravest knights in waves, but still the bridge became a graveyard of broken bodies. One of our captains tried to push forward with a spear, only to be cut down in an instant, his blood spraying across the planks. The Viking roared in triumph, and for a heartbeat, even my own courage wavered. Time seemed to stretch. Each heartbeat was a hammer blow. Each cry of the wounded a bell tolling the cost of delay. Every moment that man stood, the Vikings regrouped on the far bank, tightening their shield walls, finding courage in his stand. But fate does not allow even giants to stand forever. One of our soldiers, cunning rather than brave, slipped into the water beneath the bridge. Shielded by its wooden beams, he waded through mud and blood until he emerged directly beneath the berserker. With his spear, he thrust upward through the planks. The point pierced the Northman's belly, and the great warrior staggered. Still he roared, still he swung his axe, cutting down to more before the spear thrust again. This time higher, tearing through flesh and lung. His bellow turned to a choking rasp. He dropped his axe, and collapsed onto the bridge, his blood pouring into the river below, red as the setting sun. A silence fell, heavy and awed. Even among us, there was no cheer at first. Only the sound of our own breathing, ragged and hollow. For though he was our enemy, that Viking had fought with a courage few men ever muster. But silence is not long in battle. The horn sounded again, and the spell was broken. The bridge was ours. Our army surged forward like a flood unleashed, pouring across the span that one man had nearly made his tomb. The Vikings, seeing their champion fall, wavered. Their cries lost their strength, their shield walls trembled, and in that moment, I understood the weight of it. One man had stood between the dreams of the Vikings and the ruin of England. One man had shown them hope, and one spear had stolen it away. We pressed forward, stepping over his corpse, our boots slipping on the blood-soaked planks. I did not look down at him again, not out of disrespect, but because to look upon him too long was to question the nature of war itself. How many legends had died that day, unremembered, but for the blood that marked the ground. Yet there was no time for reflection. Beyond the bridge, Hardrada and Tostig rallied their men for the final stand. The dream of Viking conquest was not yet dead, but it bled now, and England would drive the sword deeper. The bridge had been a tomb of heroes. The field ahead would become a graveyard of kings. Once the bridge fell, the field beyond opened wide before us. The Vikings gathered there, forming their shield wall, axes and spears gleaming in the weak autumn sun. But though their formation looked strong, I could feel the tremor of doubt in their line. They had seen their champion die. They knew now that fate had shifted. We advanced as one, our own shields raised, our swords ready. The ground between us narrowed with each step, the air heavy with the stench of blood and sweat. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. The calm before a storm destined to consume men's lives. Then came the roar, and steel met steel once more. The clash was thunderous. The Vikings fought like wolves cornered, their axes swinging with bone-breaking force. Their shield wall braced against ours, wood splintering, iron ringing. I thrust my sword into the gap of a shield, felt flesh give, and yanked it free as the man fell. Another came at me, eyes wild, his axe descending. I caught it on my shield and drove my blade into his throat, but the fighting was merciless. Our line surged, then faltered, then surged again. Men screamed as they fell, trampled beneath boots, their blood soaking into the earth. The river behind us ran red, and still the Vikings held. And then I saw him, Harald Hardrada, the Thunderer, towering above his men. His mail gleamed, his helm shone, and his massive two-handed axe swept arcs of death. He seemed less a king than a force of nature, his voice booming across the field as he urged his warriors on. I remember the terror that clutched me as he advanced, cleaving through shields, scattering men like stalks of wheat. His strength was monstrous, each swing of his axe felling another soldier. For a moment, it seemed he might turn the tide alone, that his legend would carve him victory even as his army wavered. But legends bleed like any man. An arrow, loosed from somewhere in our ranks, arced high above the chaos. I followed its flight without knowing why. It struck Hardrada in the throat. He staggered, clutching at the shaft, blood pouring from his lips. His axe fell, and with it fell the will of the Vikings. A howl rose from their ranks, not of victory, but of despair. Their thunder god was dead, and with him died their hope, yet still Tostig remained, rallying the remnants, his voice sharp, desperate, filled with betrayal's venom. He urged the Northmen to fight on, shouting that reinforcements would come, that the day was not yet lost. But we pressed harder, our fury unrelenting, our swords driven by vengeance for Fulford and for every village burned. I caught sight of Tostig amidst the melee. His helm bore the crest of Northumbria, though he no longer had any right to it. His blade struck down an English knight, and for a moment his eyes met mine. I saw no regret there, no hesitation, only pride and defiance. It was then one of Harold's Hussars drove a spear into his side. Tostig cried out, staggered, and fell among the slain. Brother had betrayed brother, and brother's hand had ended him. The Viking line broke soon after, leaderless, weary, and outnumbered. They crumbled beneath our charge. Men threw down their weapons, some fled toward the river, others simply collapsed where they stood. But mercy was scarce that day. Too many of ours had fallen at Fulford. Too many had bled on the bridge. The field became a harvest of death. Bodies lay thick, piled among broken shields and shattered spears. Ravens circled overhead, their cries shrill against the silence that slowly fell as the last screams faded. From the great fleet of 300 ships that had brought the Vikings, barely 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. The rest burned or lay abandoned, empty husks marking the end of an age. As I stood there, sword heavy in my hand, I realized what we had done. We had not merely won a battle, we had shattered a dream. The Vikings, who had come to England for conquest, for glory, for revenge, would return with nothing but ashes and grief. The dream of Norse dominion in England was dead, broken upon our shields, buried beneath the bodies at Stamford Bridge. But even in that moment of triumph, I felt no joy. Only exhaustion, sorrow, and the hollow weight of knowing betrayal had cost us dearly. Brother against brother, English against English. Victory had come, yes, but it was painted in blood that could never be washed away. When the last Viking fell, the field was silent but for the crows. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of blood. I stood among the corpses, my legs trembling, my sword heavy, as though the weight of the dead clung to the steel itself. Around me, men wept or prayed. Some knelt beside fallen friends. Others scavenged what armor or weapons they could still use. Victory had been won, but it did not feel like triumph. It felt like survival. I walked across the field, stepping over the bodies of Norsemen and English alike. for betrayal had ensured that English blood ran beside Viking blood that day. Tostig's men, our countrymen, lay sprawled in the same earth as their foreign allies. I thought of his eyes when I glimpsed him in the battle, cold and proud even in the moment of death. I wondered if he regretted the path he had chosen, or if treachery had filled him with more pride than kinship ever could. Harald Hardrada's great body was found not far from the river, his throat pierced by the arrow that had stolen his roar. They said he had come to England to claim a crown by force, to seize dominion as the Norse had done for centuries. But his saga ended here, not in triumph, but in silence, face down in a foreign field. The last great Viking thunderer had fallen, and with him the dream of Norse conquest in England, of the 300 ships that had brought them across the sea. Only a handful were needed to bear the survivors home. Their longships had once been symbols of fear across the coasts of Christendom, their sails black against the horizon. Now they lay empty, abandoned, as ravens feasted where men had dreamed of glory. As we gathered in the aftermath, Harold stood among us. His armor was streaked with blood, his face grim and weary, but his eyes unbroken. He spoke not of joy, nor of boasting, but of necessity. England lives today, he said, his voice carrying across the exhausted host. The traitor is dead, the Viking is fallen. Let no man doubt that this land is ours to defend, and we shall defend it still. We cheered, though it was a hollow sound, more relief than triumph. For even as we buried our dead, I felt the shadow of what was yet to come. Word whispered through the ranks that William of Normandy, across the Channel, was already gathering his ships, already calling his knights to arms. We had shattered one storm, but another was rising. That night, I sat by the river bank, watching the water run red with the day's slaughter. I thought of loyalty and of betrayal. Loyalty had carried us through 200 miles of pain to reach this field. Loyalty had held our line against axe and spear, but betrayal, Tostig's betrayal, had cost us dearly, for no wound cuts deeper than a brother's blade. I prayed then, not only for the souls of the fallen, but for the soul of England itself. For though we had broken the Viking dream, I feared the greatest trial lay still ahead. We had beaten back the Norse, but the Normans waited, patient as wolves, ready to strike at a kingdom already bleeding. And as I laid my head down that night, sword at my side, I knew this: Stamford Bridge would be remembered as the place where English knights shattered the Viking dream. But it was also the place where betrayal revealed its true price, and where fate whispered that England's struggle had only just begun. Betrayal, revenge, and blood shaped that September day. The Vikings came with dreams of conquest, and they left with broken ships and broken hearts. Yet even as we celebrated victory, another storm was gathering across the sea. The Battle of Stamford Bridge shattered the Viking dream, but it was only the beginning of 1066.